Hi everyone, in this part we're going to tackle some of the mechanics behind the cardiovascular system. And basically what we're going to be spending our time doing is looking at three factors: blood flow, pressure, and resistance. These are three factors that determine how well your cardiovascular system works. And it's important that your cardiovascular system works well, because without it, all of your cells would cease to exist. It's the thing that, remember, drives the life-giving substance blood to all of your cells. Where we begin is just to kind of contextualize this for you. It's always mind-boggling me to consider just how many tubes are in your body. If you consider adipose tissue, and if you were to take 1 pound of that adipose tissue and you were to extract all the vessels, all the arteries, the veins, the venules, arterioles, and capillaries, and you were to line them up single file, it would stretch 200 miles. And in tissue like skeletal muscle, it would be 400 miles, because skeletal muscle has a lot more vasculature. It requires more blood flow. It's more active. Keeping this in mind, then, an average 150-pound person is going to have 60,000 miles of tubing in their body that will carry red blood cells. That's enough to go from here around the entire globe, and then around the entire globe again, and then even some after that. So incredible when you think about that. All of that 60,000 miles of tubing woven together, interspersed throughout your body to give life to all of your cells, and your heart's going to push blood through every last mile of it. Now, albeit the heart doesn't push blood through all 60,000 miles at once, but it does, nevertheless, through a discontinuous fashion, which we call vasomotion, push blood through all 60,000 miles. How does it do it? Well, we begin by studying this guy, Jean-Leonard Marie Poiseuille, who was a French physiologist, and he adapted a previously characterized equation known as Ohm's law, which was used to describe how electrons move through wires, and he adapted that to the cardiovascular system. So his kind of adaptation of it is right here. Here we see blood flow, and the change in pressure and resistance are three factors and how they relate to one another. Now, blood flow simply just refers to blood flowing through your vessels, and how well or how much blood flow goes through your vessels is determined by the change in pressure and resistance. Okay, so what we mean here in change in pressure is the difference between the pressure that's in the arterial system and the venous system. So again, remember that there's the heart here. The pressure coming off of the arteries is high, and then the blood goes to the body or the lungs, and then it comes back to the heart, and then this would be the venous side, the side that's coming to the heart. Well, this is a low pressure, and so what we have is what's called a pressure differential. There's a difference between pressures on the outgoing, on the outlet of the heart and the inlet of the heart, and so that pressure differential is going to drive flow through the cardiovascular system. Things generally move from a high pressure to a low pressure, and that's what we find here. Now, there will be, that's not the only thing to consider, because how well blood flows is not only dependent on the pressure differential, but it's also dependent on how easy it is for blood to flow through here. We could have the same pressure differential. Maybe in the arteries we're talking about a pressure of 120 millimeters of mercury, and in the veins we're talking about a pressure of maybe 15 millimeters of mercury. Well, that in and of itself will drive blood flow, but then above and beyond that, if these vessels are really skinny and it's really hard for flow to get through there, there's going to be less blood flow with that high resistance. Or if the vessels are really open and it's easy for blood flow to pass through, then there's going to be more blood flow given the exact same pressure differential. So resistance refers to how easy it is for blood to move through, and then the change in pressure is talking about the difference between the arterial and venous pressure. Now, resistance is determined by a few different things. It's determined by the viscosity of the blood. So if there is a higher viscosity means the thickness of a fluid, there is going to be a greater resistance. And this isn't hard to conceptualize. Think about taking a straw and drinking water out of it, and then take that same straw and try and drink a thick milkshake out of it. Given the same amount of energy, you will get less milkshake than you would water, because milkshakes are more viscous. They're more thick, and it takes more effort to withdraw that fluid through the exact same tube, which would be the straw. Okay, so if there's more viscosity, it's more thick, that's more resistance. I'll make a note here just to remind yourself. More resistance basically means that it's harder for stuff to flow. Less resistance then would just be the opposite. Means that it's easier for stuff to flow. Okay. So viscosity is one of the things that will determine it, and similarly, a decrease in viscosity would lead to a decrease in resistance. A second factor is the length of a vessel, and again, not hard to conceptualize here. Imagine you had a straw that was 6 inches long, and imagine you had a straw that was the same diameter but 2 miles long, and you had to blow with the same amount of energy in either straw. You would get more air flowing through the shorter straw than you would in the larger straw. This is because if you consider a tube, there is friction that happens as a fluid or something like blood or air passes across the sides of the tube. So the fluid that's passing in the tube is going to brush up against the side. That causes friction, and that energy is lost there. And so the more friction that occurs, the harder it is to move something through the tube. So in summary, if you increase the length, it will lead to a increase in the resistance. And this will then lead to a decrease in the tendency for the fluid to flow. And the converse is true. Decreasing the length will then decrease the resistance, which will then lead to an increase in flow. All right. Also, the diameter, changing the diameter will affect resistance, and it's actually the diameter which has the biggest contribution to changes in resistance in the cardiovascular system as a whole. The viscosity and the length of the vessels, they don't really change that much. Viscosity of blood will change under kind of abnormal circumstances, whether there's too many formed elements or not as, or a decreased amount of formed elements, or maybe there's too many plasma proteins because of a disease of the liver or something. Usually it's uncommon for the viscosity to change on a day-to-day basis. Same is true of length. Length certainly changes as you go from a child to adult, but once you've reached your adult state, the length is pretty much set. But what can change is the diameter, and this gets us to these two words, vasoconstriction and vasodilation. Vasoconstriction would be to decrease the diameter, make it smaller, and vasodilation would be to increase the diameter or make it bigger, and this has a huge consequence in changing resistance. Consider a vessel, two vessels of the same size, but one has a diameter that is twice as big, so it's twice as wide. This would be like 2x, and this would be x. Double the diameter. In a vessel like this, just simply doubling the diameter will make it so that the resistance is 1/16 less, which will mean that there's 16 times more flow in a vessel that has a diameter twice as big as another vessel. So even though you've only doubled the diameter, you've actually increased the flow by 16 times. So that's different than length. If you doubled the length, you would decrease the resistance by the reciprocal. So if you doubled the length, you would get half the flow, or if you quadrupled the length of a vessel, you'd get quarter of the flow. Well, here, if you were to double the diameter, you would get 16 times more flow, or if you were to cut the diameter in half, you would get 16 times less flow. So it has a huge effect in changing resistance. Here are some interesting diagrams that show you kind of the relation between diameter and flow. You can see that the one on the left is telling us the vessel diameter as we progress through the different vessels. So here's the elastic arteries, muscular arteries, arterioles, capillaries, venules, veins, and then back to the vena cava, back to the heart, from the heart. And then similarly, this shows how much blood is flowing through. I think this probably is, or not. Yeah, I guess it's just, it doesn't tell us anything about volume. It's just how many centimeters per second the blood is flowing, how fast it's flowing. And it flows really fast in the elastic arteries, and then it stops. It doesn't flow nearly as fast. It's pretty slow. And then as we get closer to the heart again, it speeds back up. You can see these are a similar shape curve, and that's because of the fact that when we have larger vessels, we have larger flow. When we have smaller vessels, we have slower flow. And then when we go back to the larger vessels, we reclaim some of that velocity and blood flow. It's easier to flow through bigger vessels. So when the vessels are big, there's more flow. When the vessels are small, there's not. Okay, now one thing that's kind of interesting though, the one place that this curve is different is the fact that in this curve, we shrink the vessel diameter, and then the vessels actually get bigger than they were. You know, a vessel such as the aorta is only 2.5 centimeters, and when we return back to the heart, the vena cava is like 3 centimeters, so it's quite a bit bigger. So if you're saying, wait a second, you know, I thought diameter, you know, the resistance was affected by a diameter, so shouldn't we actually have more flow in the vena cava because it's got a bigger diameter, which means it's less resistant, it's easier for a fluid to flow through there? The answer is yes, but a couple of things. There is a pressure differential that we have to consider. So this is, you know, when we talk about this equation, here you're seeing it in the flesh. You've got pressure and resistance all related to flow, and you can kind of see that in these diagrams. The reason why, despite the fact that you actually end up with a bigger vessel, the reason why you don't reclaim the velocity that you originally started with is because of the pressure differential. You know, when you consider a heart, and here's the arteries leaving and then the veins returning, the blood that's in these vessels, that would be like kind of like the elastic arteries, is like 100 millimeters of mercury. So the pressure differential in this spot here would be the difference between the blood that is in the artery and then the veins returning to the heart. So this is like, I don't know, this is probably like 10 millimeters of mercury, and this is 100 millimeters of mercury. So the pressure differential, the difference between these would be 100 minus 10. The differential is about 90 millimeters of mercury. So blood that is in here experiences that differential. So that's going to drive it to flow because blood flows from high to low. The pressure differential that's here would be, you know, this would probably be a vein somewhere around here that's close to the heart, but it's not maybe quite the vena cava. That would be a very small differential because the pressure here is like, I don't know, maybe 15, and the pressure here back at the heart is maybe 10. So here we only have a pressure differential of 5 millimeters of mercury. So despite the fact we have bigger vessels that should create more flow, the pressure differential isn't pushing that flow as much, and so we don't quite get back to the original flow that we started with. We've lost some energy into the system. Now this is a little bit of another thing to think about when we're talking about the veins is venous return. Because we don't have this pressure differential when we're getting to the veins, we have to rely on other things to drive flow, kind of some interesting, clever mechanisms. And the things that help us compensate for that lack of pressure differential, there's 3 of them. One are valves. You know, this is showing us like a muscle that would maybe be in a leg. And here I'm going to draw you a really terrible picture of a leg. If you consider a leg, the pressure in these veins, you know, is only whatever this is, you know, maybe 15, 20 millimeters of mercury. So that differential is only about 5 millimeters of mercury pushing fluid this way. But then you have gravity pushing down. And so gravity is actually probably pushing down on the fluid and kind of negating that tendency of fluid to want to flow because it's flowing from a high to low pressure differential. So to overcome the forces of gravity, we have these valves. The second thing is what this picture is trying to illustrate. We have what's called a skeletal muscle pump. There are veins that are kind of surrounded by muscle, and when the muscles contract, such as when you stand up or are walking or running, they squeeze the veins and they squeeze the blood out of the veins back to the heart, and that's going to increase the venous return. It's going to help force that fluid back up against the pressures of gravity and back into the heart. And then there's also what's called the respiratory pump, and this is referring to the fact that when we breathe, we momentarily create a negative pressure in our thorax. That's the thing that helps draw air in when we inhale. And that's also going to it kind of almost creates a vacuum that sucks blood into the thorax and then back to the heart. And this is pretty vital. This is also why, like, if you ever stand up really fast, you get kind of dizzy. When you stand up really fast, you go, let's say you go from, I'm going to draw you some awesome pictures here. Let's say you go from laying down. Here's a person laying down. That's their feet. Here's their head. Here's their beautiful hair. There is here's the brain, right? Here's some arms, fingers. All right. The level of the brain is about the same as the level of the feet. So there really isn't a column of fluid. The pressure of gravity is exerting equally all over the cardiovascular system. When then you go to stand up, here's the person standing up. There's their arms and their hair. Now suddenly you have all of this fluid, in your arteries, in your veins and stuff. You have a column of fluid pushing down on itself. It's extra pressure. And when you first stand up, that sudden increase of all of the fluid sinking down to your lower extremities, it pushes out your veins. It distends your veins, and that is actually going to decrease the pressure in those vessels. Anytime you increase the volume of a space, but you don't decrease the amount of fluid in that system, but you increase the space that fluid can occupy, you lower the pressure. And then your body's basically going, whoa, you've got low blood pressure, and that's why you start to feel dizzy. Your body is telling you, hey, your blood pressure is really low. Well, a workaround for that is to contract your legs, because then all the fluid that's just kind of pushed out on the veins in your legs, those skeletal muscles will actually compress the veins and push that fluid back up to your head. So it's kind of a little trick of the trade there. If you're ever nervous about standing up in a wedding, or have you been sitting for a while and you have to quick jump up, just contract your leg muscles a bit before you stand up, and that will help avoid the veins from distending as soon as they experience that pressure of gravity once you stand up. Interesting stuff there on pressure. All right, now we're going to quick revisit the the capillary bed, because I want to talk about the arterioles. The biggest place that resistance has changed by far is the arterioles that are leading into capillary beds. Sure, the systemic arteries and systemic veins will vasodilate and vasoconstrict, but the vasoconstriction and vasodilation of the arterioles has the most significant impact on what we would call total peripheral resistance, meaning the average amount of resistance in the entire cardiovascular system. Most of it is going to be impacted by what's going on with the arterioles. And generally the arterioles are going to be slightly constricted or vasoconstricted, but then they can get constricted even more so. I'm just looking here for the numbers. Yeah, an arteriole is at baseline, it's slightly constricted, and so you could say that it's vascular tone, meaning the kind of the baseline muscle activity happening in the smooth muscle is slightly vasoconstricted. And you can constrict it even further. So an arteriole could get constricted when it's maxed out. It would be about 50% of its baseline vascular tone. So if at rest, arteriole is maybe this diameter. Once it really gets squeezed, it squeezes down half the size. But then if at baseline the arteriole is completely relaxed, then it's going to actually increase its size, and it could be up to 150% of the original size. So you've got a pretty big range of motion here of what can happen in the arteriole, and that is going to greatly, significantly impact the fluid flowing through the capillary beds. All right. Now, we talked earlier that capillary beds are the place where a lot of physiology happens. We already talked about how fluid is leaving the capillaries and entering the cells that live there, and vice versa. Fluid is leaving the capillary beds, the neighborhoods of cells, and re-entering the capillaries and going back into the bloodstream. Well, the thing that drives this whole process is going to involve pressures and different kinds of pressures. So this is called capillary exchange, that event that happens when fluid enters and leaves the blood at the capillary bed. But the process that really drives it is kind of interesting. So we'll just talk a minute about this. Here's a capillary bed, all right? We've already kind of shown this picture several times, and here's our little neighborhoods of cells, yada, yada, yada. All right, well, here, remember, this is the arterial side, this is the venous side, so there is a higher pressure here than there is here, because the pressure is always getting less and less as we go from arterial to venous side. Well, there is what's called a capillary hydrostatic pressure. Hydrostatic pressure is the pressure of the fluid that is exerted on the walls, generally because gravity is pushing the fluid, and the fluid doesn't have anywhere to go because it's surrounded by these walls, so it pushes on the walls, and that pressure is about 35 millimeters of mercury. So here, at the proximal end of the capillary bed, you could say that the hydrostatic pressure, the pressure of the blood in these tubes, is pushing on the walls at a pressure of 35 millimeters of mercury. Millimeters of mercury is just a kind of a way to measure pressure. And then as fluid, and that's going to want to push fluid out, okay, into the capillary bed. Fluid goes from a high pressure to a low pressure, so there must be a higher pressure here and a lower pressure in this space, which we call, I should make a mention of this, this is an important term to know, the interstitial space. The interstitial space is the space that is occupied between the cells in the capillary bed. So fluid would go into the interstitial fluid in this interstitial space, and then from there it would, interact with the cells. But it's got to be from high to low. That's what drives movement. But the thing is that if we continually were losing fluid out of the capillary beds, you'd just continually be losing fluid out of your blood, wouldn't you? You can't continually lose fluid out of your blood vessels and then never reclaim it. Otherwise, within a matter of minutes, all of the fluid in your blood would be in your body, and you'd swell up like a balloon, and there would be no more fluid to circulate in your bloodstream, and then you would die. Okay, so it's a little bit of a curious thing that happens, because on one hand we need to have a pressure differential to move fluid from high to low, but then we also have to be able to reclaim some of this fluid, but it's hard because we already have the pressure differential, which is pushing fluid out. So what is the mechanism that brings fluid back in? It's not a pressure differential, because the pressure differential is pushing the fluid out this way. So there's a second kind of pressure called a blood colloidal osmotic pressure. And what this refers to is it's a pressure of osmosis, if you will. And let me just kind of briefly explain this. In your blood, you have a protein which is called albumin. Okay, so if I was to draw a capillary, we talked about albumin earlier. There is a pretty significant plasma protein called albumin that is found in the blood vessels. And in a capillary that is a continuous capillary, fluid can leave. Water, as well as small sugars and amino acids and electrolytes, can leave, but the plasma protein, albumin, there's other plasma proteins, but albumin is the most abundant, cannot leave. It maybe wants to leave because it wants to diffuse. There's a lot more albumin in the blood than out of the blood, so the tendency would be for albumin to want to leave. But it can't, because the walls of the continuous capillary Now this isn't true for a fenestrated capillary or a sinusoidal capillary, but it is true for a continuous capillary. The albumin can't leave, okay? And so now we have a kind of a solute gradient. There's a lot of albumin here, there's not very much albumin here. And so because of that, everything else can equilibrate between what's inside the capillary and what's inside the interstitial fluid in the capillary bed. But the albumin and the larger proteins, they cannot equilibrate. So because of that, there is always a higher osmolarity inside the capillary than outside of the capillary. Osmolarity just means how many particles per volume. So there's a higher amount of salts and particles and proteins here than there is here. Well, if you know something about water, water is the particle party animal. It always wants to go to the place where there's a higher osmolarity. So there is actually a tendency for water to be sucked back into the blood, simply because of the fact that there is more stuff inside the blood than in the fluid that is bathing the cells in the capillary bed. This is called the blood colloid osmotic pressure, and it's 25 millimeters of mercury. There's a 25 millimeter mercury pressure here of water wanting to get sucked back into the capillary. So you've got two opposing forces. You have, on one hand, the hydrostatic pressure pushing in. You also have the blood colloid osmotic pressure sucking water back in. Or sorry, you got water pushing out and water sucking back in. The hydrostatic pressure, that is the pressure of the fluid against the walls, is 35. The pressure sucking water back in is 25. So at the proximal end of the capillary bed, there's a net filtration pressure of about 10 millimeters of mercury. That's going to push fluid out. So on the net, on the proximal end of the capillary bed, we're losing fluid. Okay, but not to worry. The problem will be remedied here, and I'll tell you how. Then somewhere in the middle, as we're losing fluid, the hydrostatic pressure is going down because there's less fluid in the tube, less fluid to push on the walls because we've lost some, right? So the hydrostatic pressure goes from 35 down to about 25 once we're in the middle of the capillary bed. Well, in the middle of the capillary bed then, the hydrostatic pressure, the pressure pushing fluid out, is equated with the pressure that is sucking water back in, because the colloid osmotic pressure remains constant. It doesn't change like the hydrostatic pressure does. And so you've got 25 millimeters of mercury pushing fluid out of the capillaries, another 25 moving it back in. So there is no net movement of fluid here in the middle of the capillary bed. And then once we get to the distal end of the capillary bed, the side that's closest to the venule, then we have a little bit of a reversal that happens. The hydrostatic pressure has become even less because we're further away from the heart. We've progressed further into the tubing. So now we only have 18 millimeters of mercury pushing out, and we still maintain our 25 millimeters of mercury pushing in. So on the distal end of the capillary, we have a net pressure sucking water back in. And I don't have the figures right on me, but I believe in a given day, if you were to tally up all the liters that you lose out of your blood into the capillary bed, into the interstitial fluid, on the proximal ends of all of your capillary beds, if you average it all up, it's about 24 liters a day is lost on the proximal end. And then about 20 liters a day is reclaimed on the distal end. So at the end of the day, if you do the math, you lose 24 liters of fluid out of your blood on the proximal end. You reclaim 20 liters of fluid into your blood on the distal end. You still have lost 4 liters of blood. And my question to you is, what has happened to that 4 liters? Are you really continually every day gaining 4 liters of fluid into your interstitial space of your tissues? If that was true, every day you woke up, you'd have 4 extra liters in your tissues, and then the next day you'd have another 4 liters in your tissues, and you'd continually be losing 4 liters into your body. Before long, you'd have so much water sagging around in your body, it'd be like a big water balloon. So it can't be the case that we're really losing 4 liters of fluid. And the answer to this riddle is the fact that there are lymph vessels, is what they're called. So lymph vessels are usually illustrated in green, so I'll draw one. In reality, they're these little lymph vessels that kind of are webbed into the capillary bed. And they are kind of like veins in a way. They have a similar shape to, or a similar structure to veins. We'll look at some better pictures of this later. And the fluid, that 4 net liters of fluid that's lost is actually going to be bathing the cells. So it spends the time kind of washing the cells and giving them nutrients. And then eventually it makes its way into a lymph vessel, and then it's going to get brought into the lymphatic system and then make its way back to the heart. There are scenarios where these lymph vessels get blocked, and then this extra 4 liters can't make its way back into the heart and rejoin the circulatory system. So it is the case that they're continually gaining 4 liters of fluid. This is a situation known as lymphedema. This is going to be kind of a graphic picture, so fair warning. And this is what it looks like. You see there's a very intense swelling of these tissues of fluid. That's because there's fluid lost out of the capillary beds that isn't being reclaimed by the blood. It's staying into the tissues, so it swells out these tissues. And even if it's not lymphedema, you know, per se, maybe that the lymph vessels are fine, it still can be the case occasionally where in times where you have an elevated blood pressure, like for example women who are pregnant will have a little bit of an elevated blood pressure because they've just made 50% more blood to care for their developing fetus. And with that extra blood supply and with that extra force of the fetus pushing down on the cardiovascular system, in their lower extremities they can actually get a lot more hydrostatic pressure on the proximal ends of the capillary beds. So instead of maybe 35 millimeters of mercury, maybe it's more like 40 or 50. And so then you're losing more like 8 liters a day perhaps instead of 4, and maybe 4 liters of that is reclaimed into the lymph, and then maybe another 4 it hangs around for a little bit of an extra time than it should, and that can cause swelling in the feet. So pregnant women oftentimes will have swelling that occurs in their lower extremities, a place where gravity is really working against the normal flow of the cardiovascular system. And that's not anything like a disease state. That's just like normal mechanics. And then once the baby is born, there's less of that elevated blood pressure and hydrostatic pressure, so things kind of rebalance themselves out. Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit more at length about blood pressure. Remember that we've talked a little bit about resistance. This is set mostly by the arterioles that are going to be the gateway into the capillary beds. We talked about blood flow as basically just the flow of blood. But now let's talk about the change in pressure. What is it that causes blood pressure, and why does blood pressure get elevated? Why does it get depressed? What are the factors that influence blood pressure? Why is it important that we know about what our blood pressures are? All sorts of good stuff here to talk about. Here is just a reminder of the graphs. This is what's happening to our blood pressure as we go from our elastic arteries down to our vena cava. And again, this change in pressure refers to the pressure any place that you measure it. Maybe you measure it in the elastic arteries, or maybe you measure it in the arterioles. The change in pressure would always be where you're measuring it, and then the vena cava, really. So you look at this change in pressure here would be the change if you were measuring, let's say, the blood pressure in arterioles. Or you could be measuring the blood pressure in the aorta. If that was the case, then you'd take the blood pressure in the aorta and you'd figure out what the vena cava was, and then you'd take that difference. So blood pressure can be measured in any vessel of the body, but I will say when we generally talk about blood pressure without specifying the vessel, if you say, oh, I went to the doctor and got my blood pressure taken, what they're really doing is they're taking the blood pressure in your brachial artery, which would be kind of somewhere here. It's not really an elastic artery, it's just a little bit downstream. So keep that in mind. As long as we're talking about blood pressure, one of the ways that we measure blood pressure is a little bit tricky, right? Consider this graph. This is what the blood pressure would look like in the aorta, the elastic arteries, the muscular arteries, and the arterioles. You see it's not constant. It jumps up and down. Every time the ventricles eject a quantity of blood, which we would call a bolus, into the cardiovascular system, it makes the arteries momentarily spike, and then as that fluid passes through, then they relax again, and then once another bolus comes, they spikes, and then when it passes through, they relax again. So there's this continual fluctuation of pressure in the arterial system. You know, once we get further away from the arteries, they're so far away from the original source of the pressure, the heart, that they start to smoothen out, and you don't see that. Well, this is a little bit tricky, and so these things have different names, and it's kind of important to understand what all of these things are. When there's the peak pressure, the pressure of the vessel once that bolus of blood is really stretching the vessels out, we call that the systolic pressure. And then once the bolus of blood is passed and now the vessel is relaxed, we call that the diastolic pressure. And then the pressure that is kind of the average pressure is called the mean arterial pressure. This is the one that is kind of helpful to know because, again, it's hard to say what the blood pressure is because it's always fluctuating. So sometimes physiologists will try and calculate the mean arterial blood pressure. The way that this is done is to take what's called the pulse pressure. That is the difference between systolic and diastolic. So in this example, it would be like 110 and 75. So the pulse pressure would be 110 minus 75, because again it's systolic minus diastolic. So the pulse pressure in this scenario would be 25 plus 10, 35. And then you take 35 and you multiply it by a third. So you take the pulse pressure, you multiply it by a third. So this would be something like, I don't know, 12-ish millimeters of mercury. And then you add that fraction, the 1/3 of the pulse pressure, back onto the diastolic pressure. So that would give us, 12 plus 75 would give us 87, would be the mean arterial pressure. And for us humans, we maintain a pretty high mean arterial pressure. Usually it's between 70 and 110 is the range. And if it was to drop below, let's say 60, it probably would be not high enough to ensure circulation. Specifically, probably for regions of the body that are above the head, namely the brain. Now, your cardiovascular system will want to regulate blood pressure. We humans, we utilize a high arterial pressure system. This isn't the case for all organisms. Like fish, for example, they don't have very much metabolic activity, and they, are in water, so they don't have to deal with gravity, so they don't have actually pretty low blood pressures. But we maintain a high blood pressure. This is advantageous for a couple of reasons. One, it helps us perfuse the brain, because again, you've got to overcome that gravity to get blood to the brain. And two, it helps make your cardiovascular system more efficient. Even if we had a low blood pressure system, we could probably still get some good blood flow going through our arteries and veins, because like I said, it's really resistance that has the biggest effect on whether blood is going to flow or not. The pressure differential does help, but it's really resistance that's the main driver of blood flow. But increasing the pressure helps blood to flow quicker. Like for example, I was talking about that radiant floor heating system I designed. Anytime I'm using that system and the pressure is really low, anytime the system turns on and it starts moving fluid through my house, it just feels like the fluid is a little sluggish. When there's lower pressure, that usually means that there's more air in the system, there's more air bubbles or places where the system is compliant. So as soon as the pressure is increased and flow starts happening, there's just all sorts of nooks and crannies for the fluid to escape to, and so it takes a little bit longer for the flow to really go. If you have all the fluid super tightly packed and there's a high pressure system, that means there isn't any empty spaces or bubbles or places where the fluid can escape to. As soon as the flow needs to happen, it happens. It's very transient, it happens fast. And that's what needs to happen for a process like vasomotion, right? When the capillaries open or close, as soon as the capillary opens, there needs to be instantaneous blood flow. And as soon as the capillary shuts off, there needs to be no blood flow. And it has to happen really fast. That can only happen in a high pressure system. So we as humans maintain a pretty high blood pressure. Again, vasomotion, blood flowing through the capillaries. But the caveat is that if you have a too high of a blood pressure, it puts too much strain on the heart. Remember, here's our heart, right? Here's a little schematic. If there's too much blood pressure in, let's say, the pulmonary trunk, or let's say the aorta, these would be the arterial systems, then every time the heart contracts, it has to overcome that pressure in order for blood to flow. And so if normally you want, a systolic pressure of about 120 millimeters of mercury, and so when the heart ejects its blood, it overcomes the 120 millimeters of mercury and then it flows. Or actually, sorry, it overcomes the 80 millimeters of mercury. That's about the, overcomes the diastolic pressure, and then blood flows. Well, what if this diastolic pressure was 200 or something, right? Then the heart would have to overcome all the 200 millimeters of mercury before it would flow. And so this is why we're concerned about this thing which is called hypertension. This is a chronic high blood pressure, because it means that your heart has to work harder in order to get blood flow to happen. A high blood pressure in a momentary sense is no big deal. But if it's a chronic thing, if you chronically have high blood pressure, then it puts a lot of strain on the heart. Generally, hypertension, high blood pressure, is caused because you have either plaques or buildup in the arteries which block them, and that increases the resistance. And then with the resistance, there's a backup of fluid, which is going to increase the pressure, and so you get pressure building up in your vessels. All right, so here's our plight. We got to keep a high blood pressure so the blood pressure can't drop, but we don't want to have too high of a blood pressure, or it's going to be too much work on our hearts. So how do we regulate a very consistent range of pressure? This is what we would call as vascular homeostasis. And vascular homeostasis is not only just how we regulate pressure, but also how we regulate blood flow and resistance, because again, all three are kind of tangled together in this relationship. Vascular homeostasis basically means two things. We need to regulate our blood flow, and we need to regulate our pressure, and these two are kind of linked. So what happens to one happens to the other. Generally, the way that the body will maintain its blood flow, or maintains blood pressure, is by either changing the resistance or changing the cardiac output. So this is kind of your first hint to how the body does this. And I'll kind of do a side note here. This is what I want you to remember. Imagine, we'll take the blood pressure side here. Imagine blood pressure. Here's a vessel. There are two ways to either to change the pressure in this vessel. You can either change it by putting more fluid into the vessel. That would be something that would happen if there was a greater cardiac output. Or you could shrink the pressure in the vessel by decreasing how much fluid is getting shoved into the vessel. That would mean decreasing the cardiac output. Or you could change the pressure by, even if cardiac output was the exact same, you could change the pressure by changing the resistance. The chief way here would be by shrinking the size of the vessel. So if you shrink the diameter, and you go from like that size to this size, and assuming you haven't added or removed any fluid from the vessel, it's the same amount of fluid. Going from a bigger volume to a smaller volume with the same amount of fluid would increase the pressure. Okay, so two ways to change pressure in a vessel. One deals with changing how much fluid is entering the vessel, in other words, cardiac output. The other is by changing the resistance, or in other words, the size. So as we consider vascular homeostasis, you're going to see that there are a whole lot of ways that the body can alter cardiac output. There's a whole bunch of ways that the body can alter resistance. But don't get scared. In either case, the end result is to either change resistance of the vessel or the cardiac output. Those are going to be the two main things that are going to help us keep an adequate blood pressure and blood flow. Okay? So let's kind of descend into the physiology here. That's probably the hardest part of this chapter. This is all the different ways that your cardiovascular system can regulate itself. Regulate its blood flow, regulate its blood pressure. All right, there's two main camps here of vascular homeostasis. One is called autoregulation. One is called central regulation, and it involves kind of a two-coin approach of using both neural mechanisms and also hormones, endocrine mechanisms. Autoregulation of blood flow is something that happens locally, okay, and it happens at the arterioles. Basically, if there are cells that need a little bit extra fluid, or they need a little bit more blood flow, they'll release chemicals that cause the arterioles to vasodilate, and then that will lead to more blood flow, and then the cells can be happy. Or if the cells are getting too much blood flow, then they will stop releasing those factors, and then the arterioles will close. We've already kind of talked a little bit about this. This is the primary way that blood flow is regulated day to day in your body, and in fact right now there are probably millions and millions and millions of capillary beds which are now vasoconstricting, or millions and millions of arterioles that feed capillary beds that are now constricting and now in a second dilating and then constricting and dilating. This is happening all the time. If there was a case where there was a tissue in your body that was not getting adequate blood flow and autoregulation was not enough to fix the problem, then the body would defer to central regulation, which is what we're seeing here in all of these pathways. And the body could do it by using the nervous system, the brain, or it could use it by releasing a series of hormones. The neural mechanism, the body can measure either blood pressure directly through these things called baroreceptors. There are these little specialized cells scattered throughout your body that detect blood pressure, and if something goes awry, they can work to cause either vasoconstriction or vasodilation, and or increase the speed of the heart rate, or change the stroke, the stroke volume, anything that has to do with cardiac output. There are also these receptors called chemoreceptors, and these are going to be monitoring the pH of the blood, or also kind of synonymously the CO2 content of the blood. Usually those two are related. And if there's too much of an acidic pH, that generally means that tissues are oxygen deprived, and so it will work on the brain to start opening up blood vessels and increasing cardiac output to lead to more blood flow. Or if there's an alkaline pH, that generally means that the tissues have too much blood flow, so it'll put the brakes on everything. And then the endocrine control is, basically hormones are released to do a variety of things. So we're going to kind of look a little bit more specifically at some of these reflexes. First is autoregulation. Again, just to rehash this, under normal conditions, blood is distributed to tissues. If there's some sort of change to the blood flow that's detected by a local receptor, again, local means at the level of an individual capillary bed. This happens differently on different capillary beds. It's not like a uniform response that happens throughout the entire body. If there's changes to blood flow, there could be vasodilators released or vasoconstrictors released. Vasodilators would relax the precapillary sphincters that are leading to the capillary bed and increase blood flow to that capillary bed. That would restore homeostasis. If vasoconstrictors were released because there is too much blood flow, that would constrict the precapillary sphincters, and that would actually decrease the blood flow and then bring us back to homeostasis. This is what is done all the time in your body. If this is ineffective, we have the baroreceptor reflexes. Baroreceptors, again, specialized cells that detect pressure. They're found in a few different places. You can find them in the aortic arch. You can also find them in this place called the carotid sinus, which is that place where the internal and external carotid artery kind of split ways. There's a little space there. It's kind of the last place to monitor blood pressure before the vessel goes up into the brain. And then lastly, the right atrium. So you kind of have these, which are measuring the arterial pressure. This is measuring the venous pressure, and they can adjust accordingly. There's also kind of some more specialized ones in the vena cava as well. All right, how the baroreceptors work. They are going to work like this. Let's say there was an increase in blood pressure. All right, the blood pressure is now too high, and we want to get back to our nice comfortable range. So what would happen is if there is a high blood pressure, it's pushing the walls of the aortic arch and the carotid sinus too far. It's stretching the walls, and that would mean that it's stretching the baroreceptors. The baroreceptors can detect that extra stretch, and they're going to start sending action potentials to the brain at a faster rate than they previously were. So instead of firing little impulses as like a rate like zzz, 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 zzz to the brain, now they're going zzz, 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 and the brain is detecting, oh, something's going on with the baroreceptors. These baroreceptors, they send these little long signals from the either the aortic arch or the right atrium or the carotid sinus up to this place called the medulla oblongata. And this we mentioned earlier, this is the place that is going to have the cardiovascular centers, the cardioacceleratory center, the cardioinhibitory center, and the vasomotor center. The cardioinhibitory center would then be stimulated. If you increase the thing, if you stimulate the thing that generally decreases your heart rate, this would be an average effect of lowering the heart rate. It could also inhibit, that's what this arrow means, the cardioacceleratory centers. The cardioacceleratory centers generally increase the heart rate, so if you put the brakes on the thing that tell the heart to speed up, the net effect is to lower the heart rate. And then lastly, the vasomotor center, it's going to decrease this and cause, it's going to decrease the stimulation of the vasomotor center, which is going to cause vasodilation. When the vasomotor center is being stimulated, it causes vasoconstriction. And when we think about these net effects, what would happen if we did lowered the heart rate or increased the resistance? Well, lowering the heart rate, these are going to lower the cardiac output, holding all things else equivalent, because remember, cardiac output is determined by the heart rate times the stroke volume, right? And so if we are lowering the heart rate, assuming that we haven't really done anything with the stroke volume, then that would lead to a decreased cardiac output. Well, remember, way back here, I was saying that if you decrease the the cardiac output, imagine our vessel here that has a certain blood pressure in it, and if we go from having a lot of fluid getting shoved into that vessel and decreasing the cardiac output, so now there's a smaller amount of fluid going into that vessel, there's less fluid in the vessel, and that's less fluid to press up against the walls, so it's going to decrease the pressure. So the effect of all this is to lower the cardiac output and also vasodilation. We also said that increasing the size or decreasing the size can change the blood pressure, and so this has to do with resistance. And so if we've vasodilated, we've increased the size, we've done two things to lower the blood pressure. We've put less fluid into the blood vessel, we've given more space for the blood that already exists in the blood vessel, so we've decreased the pressure in that vessel. So both changing the cardiac output and increasing the size of the vessel is going to drop the blood pressure, and then we return to our happy homeostasis where we no longer have an increased blood pressure. Now, if this is all too scary to learn and you're like, oh my gosh, I need to stop here, I can't take any more, let me tell you that, lucky for you, the exact opposite is true for when we have a decreased blood pressure. If you have a decreased blood pressure, it's just the exact opposite of all of these effects. It's pretty much the same thing, just flip-flop. So if you have a decreased blood pressure, rather than the baroreceptors increasing their firing rate, they're now slowing down their firing rate. That's going to tell the medulla oblongata, hey, we've got a low blood pressure. And this is a very scary thing. We never want to have a low blood pressure. Again, a mean arterial blood pressure less than 60 means there's no longer enough pressure to perfuse the brain. So then the net effects of this would be if you destimulate the thing that is generally putting the brakes on the heart rate, that's actually going to lead to an increase in the heart rate. And if you turn on the thing that usually speeds up the heart rate, that would increase the heart rate. And if you turn on the vasomotor center, that's going to lead to vasoconstriction. And if you're putting more fluid into a vessel because the cardiac output is raised, and if you're squeezing that vessel down, all those things will work to increase the blood pressure, and homeostasis is restored. The chemoreceptors, here we saw that there was, under the neural mechanisms, again, this is our diagram here, this is central regulation. Under the neural mechanisms, we can monitor blood chemistry. The chemoreceptors are usually found close to the baroreceptors. And what they do is they will also signal the cardiovascular centers, okay? But another thing that they do that's really important is they also can send their signals to the respiratory centers, the ones that control breathing rate. And this is important because let's say a cell needs the nutrient oxygen. Well, up to this point, I've just been saying, well, if a cell needs oxygen, it has to just get more blood flow, and then it will get the oxygen. But that's not always the case. If the blood is void of oxygen, even if you increase the blood flow, or the blood pressure, or the cardiac output, if you're not getting oxygen into the blood, all of those changes are going to be moot. They're not going to do anything. So you have to make sure that both blood flow is adequate to the tissues, but also you have to make sure that the blood contains the nutrients that the cells need. And so generally they do, but the one that's pretty transient is oxygen. Generally there's vitamins and electrolytes and proteins that stay in the blood, but oxygen can come in and out of the blood pretty fast depending on if the respiratory system is working or not. So luckily for us, we have these chemoreceptors as kind of a safe fail to monitor how much oxygen is in the blood. They do this by assessing the pH mostly. If there's not enough O2, it generally means that there's going to be more CO2 built up. More CO2 leads to acidity, and the acidity affects the chemoreceptors. So these are important. And basically, if they detect elevated CO2 or hydrogen ions, that is to say low acidic environments, then they are stimulated and they are inhibited, the chemoreceptors are inhibited when they detect the opposite. That would be a high pH. If they are stimulated, basically they will make sure that our lungs are working faster. They're going to activate the respiratory muscles to breathe faster, to get more ventilation coming in and out of the lungs. That will hopefully allow us to blow out more CO2. We'll learn a little bit more about that when we get to the respiratory chapter. And if they're inhibited, they'll basically tell the respiratory muscles to slow down, and so that we're not breathing as fast. We're allowing some of that CO2 to accumulate more and lower the pH. Okay, so those are the neural mechanisms here. But we've also got endocrine mechanisms that help us regulate our vascular system. So the endocrine regulation's got kind of two sides to it. And generally, there's the short-term effects and the long-term effects. And I'll also say that usually the endocrine mechanisms, these ones here, they usually are going to be most effective when there is a low blood pH. They generally don't work when there's as swiftly when there's a high, they're a low blood pressure. They don't work when there's a high blood pressure. So they usually are used to correct a low blood pressure. If it's just a really quick low blood pressure, like for example, maybe there was extra bleeding or dehydration, different things like that, which could lead to losing fluid and losing consequently then your blood pressure, then what it will do is it will tell the adrenal glands to release epinephrine and norepinephrine. These will increase cardiac output by increasing the contractility. Remember, we said that one of the ways that we affect cardiac output is to change how forcefully the heart is beating. If it beats really strong, then it ejects every last bit of its blood for the most part. And if it doesn't beat very strong, then it doesn't necessarily get rid of most of its blood. So when we stimulate the adrenal glands, it increases the cardiac output basically by making a more vigorous contraction. And it also leads to vasoconstriction. And so in this setting, here's our blood vessel, our token blood vessel. we've increased the amount of fluid shoved in the vessel, and we've also shrunk the size of the vessel. Both of those are working to increase the blood pressure. Okay? So it will increase the blood pressure and homeostasis restored. If there is kind of like a chronic low blood pressure, then it employs a whole new scheme of things. It's going to involve the kidneys of all things. And we'll see once we get to the urinary chapter that the kidneys are really going to play a huge role in regulating our blood pressure. Or they don't necessarily regulate our blood pressure, but they are going to be associated with our blood pressure. The kidneys can do a couple of things. In the kidneys, this hormone called erythropoietin is made. This is made if hypoxia is detected, or meaning there's not enough oxygen in the blood. And what it will do is it will increase the amount of red blood cells, and that will help increase the blood volume because there's more red blood cells. It also increases the capacity to deliver oxygen to the tissues. So even if there is a shortage of blood around, the blood is going to be more effective, and also we're going to be en route to making more blood. Okay, another thing that kidneys can produce is this thing renin. Renin is a very powerful hormone because it turns into a substance that has a super wide array of effects. So renin gets turned into angiotensin 1. Angiotensin 1 gets converted into this thing called angiotensin 2. This is done by this enzyme called angiotensin converting enzyme, or the ACE enzyme, which is one of the coolest named enzymes out there. And this happens to make matters more confusing in the lungs. So how tangled is this web of physiology? You've got the cardiovascular system relying on the kidneys, which then rely on the lungs to then have this effect that's going to be working on all sorts of places like the brain and the blood vessels and all this stuff. So you've got all these organ systems working together to maintain homeostasis. Well, if there is a decreased blood pressure over the long haul, and renin is produced over a series of days or weeks, angiotensin 2 is made from the conversion of renin to angiotensin 1 and angiotensin 2. Then what angiotensin 2 does, this is the powerful one that actually goes and does this stuff, is it's going to release this thing called antidiuretic hormone. Antidiuretic hormone, as the name suggests, is something that is an anti-diuretic. A diuretic is something that makes you lose water, and so an antidiuretic is something that helps you retain water. So that's good. It also is going to lead to the release of aldosterone. Aldosterone is something that helps us retain salts, and so as aldosterone is secreted, it's going to help the body retain salts, and water follows the salts, and so if you retain your salts, the water will stay with it, and you will not lose the fluid that you would have in the urine. Okay, it basically works hand in hand with antidiuretic hormone. Both of these make sure that you don't pee extra water out, that you conserve every last bit of water that you can. And then it's also going to work on the brain to stimulate the thirst centers, the parts of your brain that tell you, hey, I'm thirsty, I need to go drink something. That's going to, both of those would increase the blood volume, erythropoietin, as well as the effects of renin, and that will restore homeostasis. An interesting note here, if somebody has high blood pressure, one of the things that's done to correct it is to use what's known as an ACE inhibitor. And an ACE inhibitor is going to block this so that it basically attenuates or limits the effects of angiotensin 2. And the thought is that people who are have hypertension have a little bit of this going on, where the blood volume is being increased due to the effects of angiotensin 2. And so basically, in somebody that's hypertensive, they'll say, hey, stop that. They'll block angiotensin 2 so that all of this stuff doesn't happen, and the effects of raising the blood volume and consequently the blood pressure are limited. So it helps to lower the blood pressure. But I will say, hypertension, a better cure for that is to maintain a healthy exercise routine, and to ensure that those plaques don't develop in your arteries and cause blockages and increase the resistance and things like that. Because anytime you block an enzyme, you never know if there's going to be side effects. Maybe there's a reason why this is being made, and so to just block its production could have detrimental effects. You never know. Okay, one last thing here. There's another hormone that is made by the heart called atrial natriuretic peptide. And here, this is where we're talking about here. In the endocrine control, the heart has its own thing. It makes atrial natriuretic peptide. This is released from cells that are next to the baroreceptors. And so if the cells are really, really stretched, okay, so here's your heart. These are usually found in the right atrium. Under conditions where the venous pressure in the heart is elevated, and so there's a lot of distension here of the walls, the cells will release natriuretic peptide. Natriuretic peptide is a angiotensin II antagonist, meaning it blocks the receptors of angiotensin II. Remember, angiotensin II's job was to raise blood pressure, and so if we can block that, then effectively we're lowering the blood pressure. So this is kind of interesting because normally endocrine hormones are used to raise the blood pressure, but this is a special one made by the heart to help us lower the blood pressure in cases of extreme stretching of the right atrium or extreme elevations in blood pressure. In that sense, natriuretic peptide is kind of similar to an ACE inhibitor, although it works differently. An ACE inhibitor would stop the production of angiotensin II. ACE inhibitor is a drug that we make in a lab and give to people. This is made by the heart, and rather than blocking the production of this, it blocks the binding site of this. So a little bit different mechanism. Okay, that is a lot. This is one of the biggest lectures in the whole entire course. A lot of tangled webs of physiology, and so I think it's helpful just to kind of get a little bit more acquainted with some of these things by doing some review. So I'll give you a couple of review questions to kind of give you a chance to work through these. Here's the first question. Which of the following would reduce blood pressure? Choose all that are correct. Inhibition of the cardiac oscillatory center, vasoconstriction, increased natriuretic peptide secretion, chemoreceptors stimulated, baroreceptors stimulated. Go ahead and pause the video and see if you can work through all of these 5 and see which ones would reduce a blood pressure. The answers are as follows. Let's think through this. Okay, again, I'm just going to draw my little blood vessel here. Whenever we're talking about blood pressure regulation, I just have to remember that there's 2 different ways that you can change the blood pressure in this vessel. One is by increasing or decreasing the size of it. The other is by increasing or decreasing the flow going into it. So this would be cardiac output. This would be vasodilation or vasoconstriction. So let's look at them. If we inhibit the cardioacceleratory centers, what on earth would that do to blood pressure? Well, the cardioacceleratory center is the thing that speeds up heart rate, right? If you are blocking the thing that normally speeds up the heart rate, what would that do? Well, it'll decrease the heart rate. So the first thing you have to know is what this actually would do. What's the net effect? And the answer is that it would decrease the heart rate. Okay. Then you have to think, okay, how would decreasing the heart rate affect blood pressure? Well, does decreasing the heart rate have anything to do with changing the size of the vessel? No. Does decreasing heart rate have anything to do with changing the cardiac output? Yes, because remember, cardiac output equals heart rate times stroke volume. So if I decrease the cardiac rate and I don't do anything else, effectively I've lowered the cardiac output. That's going to lower the fluid going into the vessel. That would reduce the blood pressure. So that checks out. Vasoconstriction. If I squeeze this vessel down, would that help to reduce blood pressure? The answer is no, because if you're squeezing down a tube, that's just putting more pressure on it. So this does not check out. We would not circle that. Natriuretic peptide secretion. This is released. Why? This is released when there is a high blood pressure, and its job is to lower the blood pressure. So what it does is it antagonizes the effects of angiotensin II. Angiotensin II generally raises blood pressure, and so if you block the thing that's raising blood pressure, your net effect is to decrease the blood pressure, so this one checks out. The chemoreceptors are stimulated. Chemoreceptors are going to be stimulated when there is a low pH, so that generally means there needs to be more blood flow. There also needs to be more oxygen, but those are kind of two sides of the same coin. You got to get more blood flow and also more oxygen. So this is going to work to increase the blood pressure. The effects of blood pressure are kind of more consequential in this case. Really what the chemoreceptors do is they turn the heart rate up and they vasoconstrict the vessels. That's going to increase the cardiac output and then also increase the pressure differential. That's going to help drive more flow. So these do end up increasing the blood pressure, but kind of secondarily. Their main job is to increase the heart rate, get the cardiac output going, and to shrink the vessels to create a higher pressure differential to drive blood flow. But in the process, blood pressure is actually elevated here. So, sorry, that would not be something that would reduce blood pressure, because anytime you're increasing cardiac output and shrinking vessels, that's not going to reduce blood pressure. It's going to elevate blood pressure. Okay, the baroreceptors are stimulated. These are stimulated because of an elevated blood pressure. And so if the imbalance to homeostasis is an elevated blood pressure and the fix is to lower blood pressure, well then obviously these would work to reduce blood pressure. So there you have it. I hope this gives you a little bit of practice. There'll be some additional questions on another practice kind of tutorial that you can find if you want some more help with this.